The wind moved differently across the plains of Nebraska in the autumn of 1854. It carried something heavier than dust, something that settlers would later describe as absence itself. Margaret Whitmore stood at the edge of her family's newly acquired land, staring at the horizon where the sky bled into an endless sea of golden grass. She had traveled 3 months from Philadelphia with her husband Thomas and their 2 children. They had come seeking opportunity, land, and the promise of a new beginning. What they found instead was silence, not the peaceful kind, not the restful quiet of countryside evenings. This was a different silence altogether. It pressed against the ears like water against a drowning man's lungs. The Whitmores had purchased their parcel from a government land office in Omaha. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles that seemed too large for his narrow face, had processed their paperwork with mechanical efficiency. He mentioned nothing unusual about the property. He said nothing about the families who had lived there before. Thomas Whitmore discovered the first evidence 3 days after their arrival. He was digging the foundation for what would become their farmhouse when his shovel struck something solid. At first, he assumed it was stone. Nebraska was full of limestone deposits, and striking rock during construction was common enough that it barely warranted comment. But this was not stone. Thomas knelt in the dirt, brushing away soil with his calloused hands. What emerged from the earth was a child's shoe, small, leather, handcrafted with careful stitching that spoke of skill and attention. The kind of shoe a mother makes for a beloved daughter, the kind of shoe that should never be found abandoned in unmarked ground. He told Margaret that night, after the children had fallen asleep in their covered wagon. Her face went pale in the lamplight. She asked him what he intended to do. Thomas said he would inquire in town the following morning. The town of Millbrook sat 12 miles east of their property. It was a modest settlement of perhaps 200 souls, built around a single main street, lined with wooden storefronts. Thomas rode in on their draft horse, the child's shoe wrapped in cloth and tucked inside his saddlebag. The general store owner, a portly man named Henderson, examined the shoe with an expression Thomas could not read. Henderson turned it over in his hands, studied the stitching, ran his thumb across the worn leather sole. Then he set it down on the counter and looked at Thomas with eyes that had gone flat and distant. Henderson asked where Thomas had found this. Thomas explained about the foundation, the digging, the unexpected discovery. Henderson nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had long suspected. What Henderson told Thomas that afternoon would change everything the Whitmore family believed about their new home. It would set in motion a chain of events that would span decades and touch thousands of lives. It would become the first thread in a tapestry of disappearance that official records would spend generations trying to erase. According to Henderson, the land Thomas had purchased was once home to a community called New Canaan. Founded in 1847, New Canaan had been established by a group of 43 families who had migrated together from the eastern seaboard. They were craftsmen, farmers, teachers, and tradespeople. They had come with plans, supplies, and enough capital to build something lasting. By all accounts, they succeeded. Within 2 years, New Canaan had grown into a thriving settlement of nearly 300 people. They built homes, a schoolhouse, a church, and a community hall. They established trade routes with neighboring towns. They planted orchards and cultivated fields. They created, in the words of one contemporary observer, a model of American frontier possibility. And then, in the spring of 1851, they vanished. Henderson paused at this point in his telling. He poured himself a glass of water from a pitcher on the counter. His hands, Thomas noticed, were trembling slightly. The disappearance was discovered by a mail carrier named William Foster. Foster had been delivering correspondence to New Canaan every 2 weeks for the better part of a year. He knew the residents by name. He knew their children, their dogs, their habits. He knew which families kept their curtains open and which preferred privacy. When Foster arrived on April 14, 1851, he found New Canaan empty, not destroyed, not burned, not showing any signs of violence or struggle, simply empty. The building stood intact. Breakfast dishes sat on tables, food still partially consumed. Laundry hung on lines, dry and stiff from days of sun exposure. Tools lay where they had been set down mid-task. Horses remained in their stables, unfed and desperate. Dogs wandered the streets, confused and hungry, but there were no people. Not a single soul remained. Foster searched every building. He called out names until his voice gave out. He found no bodies, no blood, no evidence of what might have happened. It was as if the entire population had simply stepped out of existence between one moment and the next. Thomas asked Henderson what the authorities had concluded. Henderson laughed at this, a bitter sound with no humor in it. He explained that there had been no official investigation, no government inquiry. No newspaper coverage beyond a single paragraph in an Omaha publication that described the event as an abandonment, likely due to harsh conditions and poor planning. The land was surveyed, divided and sold at auction within 6 months. The buildings were demolished, the orchards were cut down, the fields were plowed under. Within a year, there was no physical evidence that New Canaan had ever existed, except for what lay buried beneath the soil. Thomas returned home that evening with more questions than answers. He showed Margaret the shoe and recounted everything Henderson had told him. Margaret listened in silence, her face illuminated by the guttering flame of their single lantern. When Thomas finished, Margaret asked a question that would haunt them both for years to come. She asked why no one had come looking for these people. 300 souls do not simply disappear without someone noticing. They had families elsewhere. They had business contacts, correspondence, friends. Where were the inquiries? Where were the search parties? Where was the grief? Thomas had no answer. In the weeks that followed, the Whitmores continued to uncover remnants of New Canaan. A porcelain doll, its painted face faded but still recognizable, a leather-bound Bible with names and dates inscribed on the inside cover, a pocket watch stopped at 6:47, a wedding ring sized for a woman's finger. Each discovery deepened the mystery. Each artifact spoke of lives interrupted, of moments frozen in time, of endings that came without warning or explanation. Thomas began to investigate in earnest. He traveled to Omaha, to Lincoln, to small towns scattered across the territory. He searched government archives for records of New Canaan. He found almost nothing, a single land survey from 1848, a brief mention in a territorial census, a notice of dissolution filed in 1851 that listed no reason and no forwarding information. It was as if someone had deliberately erased New Canaan from history. Margaret, meanwhile, made a discovery of her own. While organizing their possessions in preparation for the farmhouse construction, she found a journal that had been tucked inside a trunk they had purchased at auction before leaving Philadelphia. The journal had belonged to a woman named Elizabeth Hartwell. The entries were dated 1850 and 1851. Elizabeth Hartwell had been a resident of New Canaan. The journal began ordinarily enough. Elizabeth wrote about daily life, about her husband James, about their daughter Sarah. She wrote about the community, about the challenges of frontier existence, about her hopes for the future. Her handwriting was elegant and precise, the words of an educated woman making the best of difficult circumstances. But as the entries progressed, something changed. Elizabeth began to write about strangers arriving in town. Men who asked questions but provided no answers. Men who studied the buildings with unusual intensity, who measured walls and foundations, who made notes in leather-bound books they kept hidden from curious eyes. Elizabeth wrote about meetings held in the community hall from which ordinary residents were excluded. She wrote about arguments overheard through thin walls, voices raised in fear and anger. She wrote about families packing belongings in the middle of the night and leaving without saying goodbye. The final entry was dated April 12, 1851, 2 days before William Foster discovered the empty town. Elizabeth wrote that she had been told to prepare for departure. She did not say who had told her. She did not say where they were going. She wrote only that Sarah was frightened and that James had grown silent in a way that worried her. She wrote that she hoped to continue the journal once they reached their destination. The entry ended mid-sentence. Margaret showed the journal to Thomas that night. They sat together in the darkness, the words of a dead woman burning in their minds. Thomas asked Margaret what she thought had happened. Margaret said she did not know, but she said that she thought Elizabeth Hartwell had been afraid. The Whitmores made a decision that evening. They would continue to investigate. They would find out what had happened to the people of New Canaan. They would uncover the truth that someone had worked so hard to bury. They did not know, could not have known, that New Canaan was only the beginning. They did not know that across the American frontier, in territories from the Dakotas to California, similar disappearances had occurred and would continue to occur for decades to come. They did not know that they were stumbling upon one of the most meticulously concealed episodes in American history. They knew only that 300 people had vanished and that no one had cared enough to ask why. The silence of the prairies pressed in around them as they contemplated what they had learned. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The sound was lonely and ancient, a voice calling out to a world that had forgotten how to listen. Thomas took Margaret's hand in his. He promised her that they would find answers. He promised that the people of New Canaan would not be forgotten. It was a promise he would spend the rest of his life trying to keep. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Every week, stories like this one are uncovered from the forgotten corners of history. Stories that were buried, erased, hidden from public memory. If you believe that the truth deserves to be told, that the silenced deserve to be heard, then join this community of seekers. Subscribe now, because some histories only survive when someone chooses to remember them. The years following Thomas Whitmore's discovery were consumed by investigation. What began as curiosity about a single vanished settlement evolved into something far more extensive and disturbing. The pattern that emerged from his research would challenge everything he believed about the nation he called home. Thomas started by compiling a list of every abandoned settlement he could find records of in the Nebraska Territory. The task proved more difficult than he anticipated. Official records were sparse, contradictory, and often incomplete. Land offices had changed hands multiple times. Documents had been lost to fire, flood, and simple negligence. What should have been a straightforward archival exercise became a labyrinthine journey through bureaucratic chaos. But Thomas was persistent. He spent weeks in territorial archives, cross-referencing land surveys with census data, comparing tax records with settlement maps. He corresponded with historians, librarians, and government clerks across the region. He traveled hundreds of miles to interview elderly residents who might remember the early days of territorial expansion. What he found exceeded his darkest expectations. New Canaan was not unique. It was not even unusual. Between 1845 and 1860, at least 17 settlements in the Nebraska Territory alone had been documented as abandoned under mysterious circumstances. The official explanations varied: harsh winters, crop failures, Indian attacks, economic collapse. But when Thomas investigated each case individually, the official narratives fell apart. Hartsville, founded 1846, abandoned 1849. Official explanation: drought. But records showed abundant rainfall that year, and neighboring settlements had thrived. Prosperity Creek, founded 1847, abandoned 1852. Official explanation: disease outbreak. But no death records existed, no graves were ever found, and the settlement's medical supplies remained fully stocked when discovered. New Salem, founded 1848, abandoned 1850. Official explanation: conflict with indigenous populations. But the nearest tribal lands were over 100 miles away, and no evidence of violence was ever documented. The pattern repeated itself with numbing consistency. Thriving communities would suddenly empty. No bodies would be found. Personal possessions would be left behind. Livestock would remain, and within months, sometimes weeks, the land would be resurveyed and sold to new owners who knew nothing of what had come before. Thomas began to correspond with investigators in other territories. He wrote to historians in Kansas, in Colorado, in the Dakota Territories. He contacted journalists, lawyers, anyone who might have information about similar occurrences elsewhere. The responses confirmed his suspicions. A lawyer in Denver wrote about a mining town called Silver Ridge that had emptied overnight in 1855. The miners' equipment remained. Their gold claims remained. Their personal effects remained. But the men themselves had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. A journalist in San Francisco described a fishing village on the northern California coast that had disappeared in 1858. The boats were still moored in the harbor. The nets were still hung to dry. The homes were still furnished. But the 47 residents who had lived there were gone. A minister in St. Paul recounted the story of a Lutheran farming community in Minnesota that had vanished during the winter of 1856. The livestock had frozen in their barns, unfed and unattended. The church bells had been ringing when searchers arrived, apparently set in motion by the wind. The congregation's Bible was open on the altar, as if in the middle of a service that would never conclude. Thomas compiled these accounts into a growing archive. He mapped the locations, tracked the dates, and searched for connections that might explain what was happening. The geographical spread was enormous, stretching from the Great Lakes to the Pacific coast. The timeline spanned over a decade and showed no signs of stopping, but despite the vastness of the phenomenon, certain details repeated with uncanny consistency. In almost every case, the disappearance was preceded by the arrival of strangers. Men who did not introduce themselves, who asked questions without answering any, who seemed interested in the physical infrastructure of the settlement rather than its residents. In almost every case, the settlement had been recently surveyed or assessed by government officials shortly before the disappearance occurred. In almost every case, the land was quickly transferred to new ownership under circumstances that suggested advanced planning rather than opportunistic acquisition. And in almost every case, anyone who inquired too deeply into the circumstances was met with silence, evasion, or outright hostility. Thomas shared his findings with Margaret, who had continued her own investigation through Elizabeth Hartwell's journal. Margaret had become convinced that the journal contained coded information, references, and allusions that required context to fully understand. She spent hours comparing Elizabeth's entries with historical records, trying to identify the strangers Elizabeth had written about, trying to understand the meetings from which ordinary residents had been excluded. The breakthrough came in the spring of 1857. Margaret noticed that Elizabeth had repeatedly used a specific phrase in her journal entries, the assessment committee. Elizabeth never explained who these people were or what they were assessing, but she wrote about them with a mixture of fear and resignation that suggested she understood, at least partially, what their presence meant. Thomas took this information to Henderson, the general store owner who had first told him about New Canaan. Henderson had aged considerably in the 3 years since their first conversation. His hair had gone white, and his hands shook with a tremor that suggested failing health. But his memory remained sharp, and his willingness to speak had only grown as death approached. Henderson confirmed that assessment committees had been common in the territorial era. They were ostensibly groups of government officials sent to evaluate settlements for various purposes: taxation, infrastructure development, territorial organization. Their presence was usually routine, their visits unremarkable. But Henderson had heard stories, rumors that circulated among the old-timers, the traders and trappers who had been in the region before organized settlement began. They spoke of assessment committees that served different purposes, committees that evaluated settlements not for their potential, but for their suitability. Suitability for what? No one knew, or no one would say. Henderson told Thomas about a man named Morrison, who had been a territorial surveyor in the late 1840s. Morrison had worked with these committees. He had seen what they did, understood what they were looking for. And then, in 1852, Morrison had disappeared, not vanished like the settlers of New Canaan. Morrison had simply left. He had resigned his position, sold his possessions, and traveled east. He had told colleagues that he could no longer participate in what was being done. He had said that some things weighed too heavily on a conscience. Henderson did not know where Morrison had gone, but he knew that Morrison had family in Boston. It was the only lead Thomas had. The journey to Boston took 3 weeks. Thomas traveled by horse, by stagecoach, by riverboat, and finally by rail. The distance gave him time to think, to process everything he had learned, to prepare questions for the man who might finally provide answers. Boston in 1857 was a city in transformation. The Industrial Revolution had arrived in full force, filling the streets with commerce and commotion. Thomas felt like a visitor from another world, a man of the prairie suddenly thrust into the churning machinery of modern civilization. Finding Morrison proved easier than expected. The former surveyor had returned to his family's home in Beacon Hill, where he lived quietly on inherited wealth. He had not worked since leaving the territories. He had not spoken publicly about his experiences. But when Thomas arrived at his door, explaining his purpose and his questions, Morrison invited him inside. They spoke for 3 days. What Morrison revealed would reshape Thomas's understanding of everything that had happened. It would place the disappearances in a context so vast and so deliberate that Thomas initially struggled to accept it. But the evidence was undeniable. The pattern was clear, and the implications were devastating. Morrison explained that the settlement program of the American frontier was not what it appeared to be. Acts, the promotion of territorial development, all of it served purposes that went far beyond the official narrative of manifest destiny and national growth. The frontier was a laboratory. The settlements were experiments, and the assessment committees were there to evaluate results. Morrison had been recruited into this system as a young man, fresh out of engineering school and eager for adventure. He had believed he was serving his country. He had believed he was helping to build a nation. What he discovered over years of work was something far darker. The committees were looking for settlements that met specific criteria. Morrison was never told exactly what those criteria were, but he learned to recognize the patterns. Settlements that were particularly successful, particularly cohesive, particularly self-sufficient, these were the ones that attracted attention. These were the ones that received visits. These were the ones that eventually disappeared. Morrison did not know where the people went. He did not know who made the final decisions or what happened after the assessments were complete. He knew only that certain settlements were selected and that shortly after selection they ceased to exist. He had seen the aftermath. He had walked through empty towns where meals were still on tables and clothes were still in closets. He had seen the efficiency with which these places were erased from memory, their records destroyed, their land transferred, their very existence denied. Morrison had kept quiet for years. The fear of what might happen if he spoke was too great. But time had worn away that fear. He was an old man now, with nothing left to lose. He wanted someone to know what he knew. He wanted the truth to survive, even if it could not change what had been done. Thomas asked Morrison the question that had haunted him since he first discovered the child's shoe in his foundation. He asked why. Why would anyone do this? What purpose could possibly be served by making entire communities disappear? Morrison's answer was simple and terrible. He said he did not know. He said that understanding the purpose had never been part of his job. He said that the people who ran this system were careful to compartmentalize, to ensure that no single person understood the full picture. But Morrison had a theory. He believed that certain settlements were being relocated, not eliminated. He believed that the people were being taken somewhere, moved to locations that served purposes he could not fathom. He believed that what appeared to be disappearance was actually appropriation. He believed that someone was building something with these people, something that required specific types of communities, specific combinations of skills and resources, specific human material. What that something was, Morrison could not say, but he believed it was real, he believed it was ongoing, and he believed it was far larger than anything Thomas or anyone else had yet imagined. Thomas left Boston with Morrison's documents, copies of surveys, assessment reports, internal memoranda that Morrison had saved over the years. They were incomplete, frustrating in their gaps and redactions, but they provided evidence. They provided proof that what Thomas had discovered was not imagination nor coincidence. The pattern was real. The disappearances were coordinated. And someone, somewhere, knew exactly what had happened to the people of New Canaan, and hundreds of settlements like it. Thomas returned to Nebraska with a new purpose. He would continue to investigate. He would continue to document. He would build an archive that could not be destroyed, a record that could not be erased. The truth would survive. He would make certain of it. The decade following Thomas Whitmore's meeting with Morrison was marked by obsessive documentation. What had begun as one man's quest for answers evolved into a network of investigators spread across the expanding nation. The truth, it seemed, was too large for any single person to contain. Thomas established correspondence with 17 researchers by 1862. They were an unlikely coalition: a retired Army officer in Colorado, a schoolteacher in Kansas, a journalist in California, a minister in Minnesota. Each had stumbled upon evidence of the disappearances independently. Each had been dismissed, ignored, or warned to stop asking questions. Each had continued anyway. The network operated through coded letters and clandestine meetings. They shared documents, compared findings, and gradually assembled a picture of the phenomenon that none of them could have constructed alone. The scale of what they uncovered defied easy comprehension. By their most conservative estimates, over 12,000 people had vanished from frontier settlements between 1845 and 1862. The actual number was likely far higher. Many disappearances had gone unrecorded, the settlements too small or too isolated to leave traces in official records. The geographical spread extended from the Canadian border to the Mexican territories, from the Mississippi River to the Pacific coast. No region was immune, no type of settlement was safe. Mining camps, farming communities, fishing villages, trading posts, all had been affected, and the disappearances were continuing. In the spring of 1863, the network received word of a new case. A settlement called Harmony Falls in the Oregon Territory had emptied under circumstances identical to those Thomas had documented years earlier. The population of 237 people had vanished overnight. Their belongings remained. Their livestock remained. But the people themselves were gone. The network dispatched one of their members to investigate. His name was Dr. Charles Weber, a physician from San Francisco who had joined the effort after his own brother disappeared from a California ranching community in 1859. Weber spent 3 weeks in Oregon, interviewing neighbors, examining the abandoned settlement, and searching for any evidence that might explain what had occurred. What Weber discovered added a new dimension to the mystery. Among the personal effects left behind in Harmony Falls, Weber found a letter. It was addressed to a woman named Catherine Marsh, and it came from her sister Sarah, who had apparently left the settlement several weeks before the disappearance. The letter was remarkable for what it revealed about the final days of the community. Sarah wrote that she had been approached by a man who called himself Mr. Aldridge. He was polite, well-spoken, and seemed to possess detailed knowledge about Harmony Falls and its residents. He had offered Sarah an opportunity, a chance to relocate to what he described as a planned community, a place where skilled settlers could contribute to a greater purpose. Sarah had been skeptical at first, but Aldridge had been persuasive. He had spoken of educational opportunities, of advanced infrastructure, of a community designed according to scientific principles. He had promised security, prosperity, and a role in building something unprecedented. Sarah had agreed to go. She had left Harmony Falls 3 weeks before the disappearance, traveling with a small group of other volunteers to a destination she did not name in her letter. She wrote that she would send more information once she arrived, that she would explain everything when she could. The letter had no return address. Sarah Marsh was never heard from again. Weber's discovery suggested something Thomas and his colleagues had long suspected. The disappearances were not random. They were organized. They were voluntary, at least initially, and they were conducted by individuals who had names, who had methods, who operated with the confidence of people protected by powerful interests. The network began to search for other mentions of Mr. Aldridge or similar figures. What they found confirmed the pattern. Across dozens of cases, witnesses reported encounters with well-dressed strangers who offered opportunities, who spoke of planned communities, who promised futures that seemed too good to refuse. The names varied: Aldridge, Mitchell, Crawford, Pierce, but the descriptions were remarkably consistent. These were educated men, articulate and knowledgeable. They seemed to know everything about the settlements they visited, who lived there, what skills they possessed, what resources they controlled. They arrived without warning and left without trace, and in their wake, communities vanished. The Civil War interrupted the network's investigations. The conflict consumed the nation's attention and resources, leaving little room for inquiries into frontier disappearances. Several members of the network were killed in the fighting. Others lost contact as postal routes were disrupted and territories were thrown into chaos. Thomas Whitmore remained in Nebraska, too old for military service, but too committed to abandon his work. He continued to document cases, to collect testimonies, to build the archive that he hoped would one day expose the truth. Margaret worked alongside him, cataloging evidence and maintaining correspondence with the network members who remained active. The war years were dark ones. The violence and destruction that engulfed the nation seemed to render the mystery of the frontier disappearances almost trivial by comparison. Hundreds of thousands were dying on battlefields. What did it matter that thousands more had vanished from settlements that official history barely acknowledged? But Thomas refused to accept this reasoning. The dead of the battlefield were mourned. Their sacrifices were recognized, their names recorded. The vanished of the frontier had no such recognition. They had been erased, not just from their land, but from memory itself. To forget them was to complete the crime that had been committed against them. The war ended in 1865. The nation began the long process of reconstruction and recovery, and the disappearances resumed. The first post-war case came to Thomas's attention in the autumn of 1866. A settlement called Prairie Junction in the Dakota Territory had emptied over a single weekend. The circumstances were identical to cases documented 2 decades earlier. The methods had not changed. The pattern persisted. Thomas was 63 years old when he received this news. His health had declined during the war years, and the weight of everything he knew pressed heavily upon him. He had spent nearly half his life investigating a mystery that seemed no closer to resolution than when he had first discovered a child's shoe in his foundation. Margaret urged him to rest, to let younger investigators carry the burden. But Thomas could not stop. He felt a responsibility to the vanished that transcended his own physical limitations. He had promised all those years ago that the people of New Canaan would not be forgotten. He intended to keep that promise. In the spring of 1867, Thomas received a letter that would mark a turning point in his investigation. The letter came from a man named James Carpenter, who identified himself as a former employee of the Federal Department of Interior. Carpenter claimed to have worked in a division that most Americans had never heard of, a division that existed in the shadows of official bureaucracy. Carpenter was dying of tuberculosis. He had perhaps months to live, possibly weeks. He had spent years wrestling with what he knew, torn between fear and conscience. Now, with death approaching, he had decided to speak. Thomas traveled to Washington to meet with Carpenter. The journey was arduous for a man of his age and condition, but he made it. He found Carpenter in a boarding house near the Capitol, thin and pale, his breathing labored and his eyes bright with fever. Carpenter spoke for 2 days, pausing only when coughs racked his failing body. What he revealed confirmed and expanded everything Thomas had learned over the previous 2 decades. The disappearances were part of a program, a government program, though one that operated outside normal channels and reported to no elected officials. The program had begun in the early 1840s and had continued, with various modifications ever since. Its official name, according to Carpenter, was the Population Redistribution Initiative. Its stated purpose was to identify and relocate settlers who possessed skills and characteristics deemed valuable for strategic development. Its real purpose, Carpenter suspected, was something else entirely. Carpenter had worked as a clerk in the initiative's administrative offices. He had processed paperwork, filed reports, and maintained records. He had never been told the full scope of the operation, but he had seen enough to understand that it was vast, well-funded, and entirely invisible to the American public. The initiative operated through a network of recruiters, the men Thomas had been tracking under names like Aldridge and Mitchell. These recruiters identified promising settlements, assessed their populations, and selected individuals or families for relocation. Sometimes the selection was voluntary, sometimes it was not. The destinations were never recorded in documents Carpenter could access. The relocated settlers simply disappeared from all official records as if they had never existed. Their lands were confiscated, their possessions distributed, their very names erased from census rolls and tax lists. Carpenter believed that the settlers were being taken somewhere in the American interior. He had overheard conversations suggesting facilities, infrastructure, entire communities built in remote locations beyond the reach of normal oversight. But he had no proof. He had no names of places, no maps, no documents that survived the initiative's rigorous security protocols. What he did have were numbers. During his time with the initiative, Carpenter had maintained his own private tallies, hidden records that he kept against the possibility that someday he might find the courage to speak. According to Carpenter's numbers, between 1842 and 1866, the initiative had processed over 47,000 relocations. 47,000 men, women and children removed from their homes and sent to destinations unknown. Thomas sat in silence as this number sank in. 47,000, more than the population of many American cities, more than the casualties of entire battles in the recent war. A population large enough to fill a county, erased from existence as if it had never been. Carpenter died 3 days after their final conversation. Thomas arranged for his burial in a cemetery outside Washington, paying for a headstone with his own money. The inscription read only, "Here lies a man who told the truth." Thomas returned to Nebraska with Carpenter's testimony and his own renewed determination. The scope of what he had uncovered was staggering, but it was also clarifying. This was not a mystery without explanation. It was not a natural phenomenon or a series of coincidences. It was a deliberate, systematic program conducted by agents of the American government against its own citizens. The question now was not what had happened, but why. What purpose could possibly justify such an undertaking? What was being built with these stolen lives? Where had 47,000 people gone? Thomas did not have answers. But for the first time in decades of investigation, he felt he was asking the right questions. If you've made it this far in this story, you understand that some histories are not meant to be forgotten. Leave a comment saying, "The silence remembers what the records erased." Let the algorithm know that stories like this deserve to be told. Let those who vanished know that someone, finally, is listening. The final years of Thomas Whitmore's life were dedicated to mapping what he called the geography of disappearance. Armed with Carpenter's testimony and 2 decades of accumulated evidence, he set out to chart the full extent of the population redistribution initiative. The task was monumental. Thomas was 71 years old, his health failing, his resources limited. Margaret had passed away in 1872, taken by a fever that swept through the Nebraska plains. He continued alone, driven by a promise made decades earlier to people he had never known. His method was meticulous. He obtained county land records from every territory and state in the western half of the nation. He cross-referenced these with census data, tax rolls, and postal registries. He looked for settlements that appeared in some records but not others, communities that existed in one document but were absent from the next. The patterns he found were disturbing in their consistency. In Kansas, he identified 23 settlements that had disappeared between 1854 and 1870. In Colorado, the number was 31. In California, 47. Across the entirety of the American frontier, he documented over 240 distinct cases of community-level disappearance. And these were only the cases that left traces. For every settlement that appeared briefly in official records before vanishing, Thomas suspected there were others that had been erased so thoroughly that no documentation survived at all. He began to notice geographical patterns in the disappearances. They clustered around certain features: mountain passes, river confluences, areas of unusual geological formation. Settlements in these locations seemed especially likely to be targeted by the initiative. Thomas did not know what to make of this observation. The significance of geography in the selection process remained unclear, but he documented it anyway, adding it to his growing archive of unexplained details. In 1874, Thomas received a visitor who would add another piece to the puzzle. His name was Dr. Samuel Hawthorne, a geologist from the Smithsonian Institution who had spent years surveying the American interior. Hawthorne had heard of Thomas's research through academic channels and had traveled to Nebraska specifically to share information. Hawthorne had been conducting surveys in remote areas of the Rocky Mountains when he discovered something that defied explanation. In a valley accessible only by treacherous mountain passes, he had found evidence of extensive human habitation: foundations, roadways, irrigation systems, the remnants of what appeared to be a substantial settlement. But no such settlement appeared on any map. No record of its existence could be found in any archive. When Hawthorne inquired with the Bureau of Land Management, he was told that the area had never been surveyed, let alone settled. Hawthorne had investigated further. He had found personal effects among the ruins: clothing, tools, household items. He had found a cemetery with over 200 graves, the headstones worn but still legible. The dates on the headstones spanned from 1848 to 1867. The names on the headstones were unfamiliar, But when Thomas compared them with his own records, the connections became clear. At least 40 of the names matched individuals who had been documented as residents of settlements that had subsequently disappeared. Thomas finally had evidence of a destination, somewhere in the Rocky Mountains, in a location deliberately omitted from official maps. The initiative had built something. The vanished settlers had been taken there. Some had lived there for years. Some had died there. But what had they been doing? What purpose had they served? And what had happened to the settlement that had once stood in that remote valley? Hawthorne could not answer these questions. The site he had discovered was abandoned, apparently for years. Whatever activity had occurred there had long since ceased. The people were gone, leaving only graves and ruins. Thomas added Hawthorne's findings to his archive. He began to search for other evidence of hidden settlements, places that existed in the physical world but not in official records. The search led him to sources he had never before consulted: Native American oral histories, trappers' accounts, explorers' journals from before the era of organized settlement. What he found suggested a network of such places scattered across the American interior in locations chosen for their isolation and their unique geographical features. Some were described as mining operations, others as agricultural communities, others as facilities whose purpose the observers could not determine. The descriptions were fragmentary, second-hand, often decades old. But taken together, they painted a picture of systematic development in regions that official history presented as empty wilderness. Someone had been building in the American interior long before the frontier was supposedly open to settlement. Thomas spent his final years trying to piece together what this building had been for. He corresponded with scientists, engineers, and academics across the country. He studied geology, metallurgy, and the emerging field of electrical science. He sought any framework that might explain why thousands of people had been relocated to hidden settlements in remote mountain valleys. He found no definitive answers, but he developed theories. The locations where hidden settlements had been found shared certain geological characteristics. They were areas of unusual mineral deposits, places where the earth held concentrations of specific elements that were only beginning to be understood by contemporary science. Hawthorne had noted similar deposits at the site he discovered. Veins of copper and iron running through the surrounding rock, crystals that seemed to vibrate with energy when struck. Thomas wondered if the relocated settlers had been put to work extracting these resources. He wondered if the initiative was not merely relocating populations, but mobilizing them for a specific industrial purpose. But this explanation felt incomplete. The scale of the operation seemed too vast for simple resource extraction. The secrecy seemed too absolute for activities that could be explained by economic motives. There was something else at work, something that required not just labor, but specific types of labor, not just people, but specific types of people. Thomas thought often of Elizabeth Hartwell's journal, of her descriptions of assessment committees evaluating New Canaan. He thought of Carpenter's account of recruiters selecting individuals based on skills and characteristics. The initiative was not indiscriminate in its relocations. It was selecting carefully, assembling populations that met criteria that remained unknown. What were those criteria? What combination of skills, knowledge, and abilities made certain settlements valuable enough to appropriate entirely? What was being built that required such specific human material? These questions consumed Thomas's final years. He never found answers that satisfied him, but he continued to document, to compile, to preserve. He was building an archive for future generations, a record that might someday provide what he could not: understanding. Thomas Whitmore died on March 14, 1879. He was 76 years old. He died in the farmhouse he had built on land that once belonged to the people of New Canaan, surrounded by boxes of documents, stacks of correspondence, and years of accumulated evidence. His obituary in the local newspaper described him as a farmer and amateur historian. It made no mention of his life's work. It made no mention of the 12,000 or 47,000 or however many souls had vanished from the American frontier. It made no mention of the truth he had spent decades trying to uncover. He was buried next to Margaret in a small cemetery outside the town that had grown where Millbrook once stood. His headstone bore his name, his dates, and a simple inscription he had chosen himself. He remembered those who were forgotten. The archive Thomas had built survived him. His children, who had grown up amid boxes of documents and late-night conversations about mysteries they barely understood, preserved it. They added to it, continuing their father's work in smaller ways. They passed it to their own children and their children's children. The archive grew, the investigation continued, and the disappearances did not stop. The generation that inherited Thomas Whitmore's work faced challenges their predecessor could not have imagined. The American frontier had closed. The nation had industrialized. The patterns of settlement and movement that had characterized the 19th century gave way to new patterns shaped by railroads, telegraph lines, and the growing apparatus of modern government. But the disappearances continued. Thomas's grandson, William Whitmore, took custody of the archive in 1892. He was 28 years old, an engineer by training, and pragmatic by temperament. He had grown up hearing stories of his grandfather's obsession, stories that his parents treated with a mixture of reverence and embarrassment. He had always assumed the mystery would remain unsolved, a curiosity from a more chaotic era. The events of 1893 changed his mind. In the spring of that year, William received a letter from a colleague in Chicago. The letter described an extraordinary occurrence at the World's Columbian Exposition, the great fair that was celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. Among the millions who visited the fair was a woman who claimed to have escaped from a place she called the Cooperative. She had approached journalists, police officers, anyone who would listen, with a story that seemed too incredible to believe. According to this woman, whose name was Ruth Anderson, she had been born and raised in a settlement that did not exist on any map. Her parents had been taken from their home in California when she was an infant, relocated by government agents to a community hidden in the mountains of Nevada. The settlement, which its residents called the Cooperative, was entirely self-contained. It had farms, factories, schools, and hospitals. It had over 5,000 residents, all of whom had been brought there from various parts of the country over a period of decades. It operated under strict rules that prohibited contact with the outside world. Ruth had escaped by hiding in a supply wagon that made infrequent trips to purchase materials unavailable within the Cooperative. She had spent months making her way across the country, terrified of recapture, unsure of whom she could trust. She had arrived at the exposition, hoping that the crowds and attention might offer her protection. William traveled to Chicago immediately upon receiving this letter. He found Ruth Anderson in a boarding house on the city's south side, guarded by the journalist who had first heard her story. She was thin, exhausted, and visibly frightened. But when William showed her documents from his grandfather's archive, names, dates, locations, her fear gave way to something else: recognition. Ruth confirmed details that only someone with direct knowledge could have known. She identified names from Thomas's records as people she had grown up with in the Cooperative. She described the assessment process her parents had undergone before relocation. She spoke of the recruiters, the promises, the methods that had remained unchanged for half a century. And she provided something Thomas had never obtained: a description of what the Cooperative was actually for. According to Ruth, the settlement was dedicated to a single purpose: preservation. The residents were craftsmen, engineers, farmers, teachers, people selected for their skills and their knowledge. They were tasked with maintaining techniques, methods, and technologies that the outside world was abandoning in its rush toward industrialization. The cooperative was a living archive, a repository of human capability, a safeguard against a future that someone, somewhere, believed would require the skills of the past. Ruth did not know who had established the cooperative or who controlled it. She knew only that supplies arrived regularly, that officials visited occasionally, and that anyone who attempted to leave was pursued with ruthless efficiency. She had been lucky to escape. Others had not been. William documented Ruth's testimony over several weeks. He verified what details he could, cross-referencing her account with his grandfather's records. The correlations were undeniable. Ruth Anderson was telling the truth. But before William could decide what to do with this information, Ruth disappeared. She vanished from the boarding house one night, leaving behind only a brief note apologizing for putting others in danger. She was never seen again. William searched for her for years. He never found her. He never learned whether she had fled voluntarily or been taken. He never discovered whether she had made it back to the cooperative or found sanctuary elsewhere. But her testimony survived. William added it to the archive, alongside his grandfather's documents and his own investigations. The picture was becoming clearer, even as the mystery deepened. The cooperative was real. The relocations were ongoing. And someone was building something that required the preservation of human knowledge on a massive scale. The 20th century brought new technologies of surveillance and control, but also new opportunities for investigation. The Whitmore archive passed through 4 more generations, each adding their own discoveries to the collection Thomas had begun. By 1929, the archive contained documentation of over 300 settlement disappearances spanning 85 years. It contained testimonies from 17 individuals who claimed direct knowledge of the relocation program. It contained maps, correspondence, government documents obtained through various means, and the accumulated wisdom of 5 generations of investigators. And it contained a final revelation that would bring the investigation to its conclusion. In the autumn of 1929, a man named Edward Marsh arrived at the Whitmore family home in Nebraska. He was elderly, frail, and clearly near the end of his life. He carried with him a leather satchel filled with documents he claimed would explain everything. Edward Marsh was the great-grandson of Sarah Marsh, the woman who had written to her sister Catherine from Harmony Falls in 1863, the woman who had been recruited by Mr. Aldridge and had never been heard from again. Sarah had not disappeared. She had lived a long life in a place she was never permitted to name. She had raised children there, grown old there, died there. But before her death, she had entrusted her grandson with a mission to find her family's descendants and tell them the truth. Edward had spent decades searching. He had finally found the Whitmores through a genealogical society that had preserved records of the Marsh family. He had traveled from a location he refused to identify to deliver his grandmother's final message. The documents Edward carried were copies of records from within the program itself. They revealed the scope, the purpose, and the ultimate fate of the Population Redistribution Initiative. The program had been established in 1842 by a consortium of government officials and private interests who believed that American civilization was expanding too rapidly to sustain itself. They feared that the knowledge and skills of traditional craftsmanship would be lost in the rush toward industrialization. They feared that the nation would become dependent on technologies it did not fully understand, controlled by forces it could not resist. Their solution was preservation through isolation. They would identify communities that embodied the skills and values they wished to preserve. They would relocate these communities to protected locations where they could continue their ways of life undisturbed. They would create, in effect, a backup of American civilization, a reserve that could be drawn upon if the main current of progress faltered. The program had operated continuously for nearly 90 years. It had established 17 major settlements and dozens of smaller facilities across the American interior. It had relocated over 100,000 people across 4 generations, and it had succeeded in its purpose. The skills it preserved, traditional agriculture, craft manufacturing, community organization, had been maintained in living form, while the outside world rushed headlong into an industrial future whose consequences no one could predict. But the program had also failed. The isolation it enforced had created communities cut off from the very civilization they were meant to preserve. The secrecy it required had demanded sacrifices, of freedom, of family, of the basic rights that Americans took for granted. The people who had been relocated had paid a price that no one had asked them to accept. Edward Marsh did not condemn the program. He did not excuse it either. He simply described it with the weary acceptance of someone who had lived his entire life within its boundaries. The settlements still existed. They still operated. They still preserved the skills and knowledge that the program's founders had deemed essential, but they were changing. The isolation was breaking down. The outside world was reaching in through radio signals and airplane sightings and the simple passage of time. Edward believed the program would end within his lifetime. The world it had been designed to protect against had arrived anyway, through depression and war and technological transformation. The backup was no longer necessary. The experiment was concluding. He had come to the Whitmores to ensure that the truth would survive. He had come to fulfill a promise his grandmother had made to a sister she never saw again. He had come to close a circle that had remained open for over 70 years. Edward Marsh died 3 weeks after delivering his documents. He was buried in the Whitmore family cemetery next to Thomas and Margaret and the generations who had carried forward their work. The archive was complete. The mystery was solved. The people who had vanished from the American frontier had not been destroyed. They had been preserved, saved in a sense, from a future that their preservers did not trust. Whether this was a crime or a salvation, the Whitmores could not say. History would judge, memory would endure, and the silence that had covered 85 years of disappearance would finally, irrevocably, be broken. The wind still moves differently across the plains of Nebraska. It still carries something heavier than dust, but now, perhaps, it carries something else as well. It carries the names of those who vanished. It carries the truth of what was done. It carries the echo of 100,000 lives that were hidden from history, but never truly lost. They are remembered now. They will not be forgotten again. If you watch this far, it's because this story touched something in you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far, so I can get to know you and know who really appreciates the stories on this channel." If this case moved you, if you believe that forgotten histories deserve to be told, then subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell. Every week we uncover stories that were buried, erased, hidden from public memory. Leave your like. It helps this video reach others who are searching for the truth. And share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Some histories only survive when someone chooses to pass them forward. The silence has been broken. Now it's your turn to carry the echo.